Hey everyone! Today I will be taking a look at two stories from the book of Genesis that really stand out to me. The stories of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and the story of Joseph with his coat of many colors. At a quick glance, these stories can seem really different. One takes place at the beginning of time, and the other one follows the life of a young boy betrayed by his own family. But after reading them, I noticed that they actually have something very important in common. Both stories are about choices, betrayal, and forgiveness. Yes, they show us how our decisions can have consequences, but both of them show us how God continues to work through these consequences. Let's start with the first story, Adam and Eve. At the beginning of Genesis, God creates the world and everything in it. Eventually, he creates the first human being, Adam, and puts him in the Garden of Eden. The garden is described to be this perfect place, a paradise. Therefore, Adam has everything he could possibly need. There is no suffering, no fighting, and no fear. God gives Adam the responsibility of caring for creation and naming all the animals. We often refer to this role as being stewards of his creation. One thing I find interesting is that Adam isn't just placed in this paradise. Right from the start, God gives him purpose. I think this speaks volumes about what it actually means to be made in God's own image. Humans weren't meant to be just observers, rather, we were meant to be active participants in creation. Adam alone. After Adam names all the animals, God realizes that he's alone. Even though he is surrounded by all of creation, there is nobody truly like him. So God creates Eve. I think this part of the story highlights how relationships are essential to being human. We aren't made to go through life completely on our own. We were made for connection. Whether it's family, friends, or community, everybody, people need connections with one another. And I think this creation of Eve shows that companionship is a part of God's design. Now we arrive at one of the most important parts of the story, and arguably one of the most well known parts of the Bible. God gives Adam and Eve complete freedom to enjoy the garden. There is only one rule: they can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Whenever reading this part, it's easy to wonder why the tree was even there in the first place. My interpretation is that the tree is the first representation of free will. God could have created humans who automatically obeyed him, but instead, he gives Adam and Eve a choice. God wants us to love him back just as he loves us, and without that choice, obedience wouldn't mean anything. Love only matters when we have the freedom to choose it. The snake. These choices are often made more difficult with temptation, however. The snake arrives and questions God's command, convincing Eve to doubt what God had said. What stands out to me here is that this isn't about the fruit at all. It's about trust and free will, as I said earlier. This is also a part of a much larger debate whether the events in Genesis are meant to be taken literally or not. My interpretation is that it serves as an explanation of free will, obedience, and betrayal, and it explains the birth of sin. The serpent then suggests that Adam and Eve should decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong instead of trusting God. The beginnings of sin. Eve eventually eats the fruit and gives some to Adam. He eats it as well. At that moment, sin enters the world, or as we like to call it, original sin. What I find most interesting is that neither Adam or Eve are forced to make this choice. It's not like the serpent forced them or threatened them, they chose it by themselves. And this is why the story is so closely connected to the idea of free will. Human beings have the ability to make good choices, but we also all have the ability to make bad ones. The story reminds us that all of our actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences affect not just ourselves, but also others, which also explains how this story in Genesis touches on ideas of selflessness versus selfishness. Because they disobeyed God, Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. But I don't think this part of the story is just punishment. Even after they leave the garden, God doesn't just abandon them. For me, the biggest takeaway from this is that everyone will make mistakes, but God's relationship always prevails. Yes, consequences will happen, but God's presence is always there. Now we're going to jump ahead to another story that really stands out to me. The story of Joseph and his coat of many colors. Joseph was the youngest of 12 brothers, and he was the favorite son of his father Jacob. And because of that favoritism, his father gave him a special coat characterized by bright colors. Joseph hadn't necessarily done anything wrong, but his brothers felt overlooked and resentful. This part of the story feels very realistic to me and relevant to today, especially because jealousy is something that everyone can experience at some point in life. In fact, envy is one of the capital sins. The famous coat, dubbed the coat of many colors, represents how special Joseph was to his father. While it may seem like just a measly gift, it becomes the source of growing opposition within the family. It fuels these divides between his brothers. It is obvious that the coat represents something more than just a piece of clothing. Instead, it represents recognition and jealousy. Joseph's brothers constantly see the coat and are reminded that Joseph is the favorite. As the story progresses, the brothers become increasingly jealous. What interests me here, though, is how this jealousy manifests. It doesn't just appear overnight, or it isn't prevalent right at the start of this story. It keeps growing and developing. At first, the brothers are just annoyed. Then they become angry, and then eventually this turns into hatred. My interpretation is that the story acts as a warning about what happens when negative emotions control us, especially when feelings such as hatred are left unchecked. This is the part of the story where the brothers eventually choose to betray Joseph. They throw him into a pit and later sell him to traders. Imagine how devastating that must have been. He was betrayed by his own family. This is probably one of the darkest moments in the story. At this point, it seems like Joseph's life is completely falling apart, and yet he is still expected to trust in God's plan. But I think this part of the story is really important because it ties back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The brothers made this choice to sin, and they made this choice to betray his brother. And I just think that's really important to understand, that we all have the free will to make these choices. So, as the story goes, Joseph is taken far away to Egypt, with no family, no home, and nobody knows what will happen to him at this point in the story. This is where his faith is the strongest, though. I really admire how in this moment Joseph continues moving forward, despite the challenges and betrayal he faced. This story emphasizes faith even during these impossible circumstances. Eventually, Joseph develops an ability to interpret dreams. With God's help, he explains the dreams of Egypt's king and predicts years of abundance followed by years of famine. Because of this God-given ability, though, Joseph earns the king's trust, which shows that something good came out of this terrible situation. I think this also shows the importance of perspective, because if you think about it, Joseph would have never been able to help this country if he hadn't been sold by his brothers. Joseph then comes to rise as one of the most powerful leaders in Egypt. What an incredible transformation this is for him. Just a few moments ago, it seems, he was sitting alone at the bottom of a pit after being sold away from his family and being left alone. Now here he is helping guide an entire kingdom in a land he didn't even know. Finally, years later, Joseph's brothers arrive in Egypt seeking food during the famine that Joseph had predicted. They don't realize at first, though, that the leader standing before them is their own brother Joseph. Eventually, Joseph then realizes he has a choice. He could either take advantage of them and choose revenge, or he could choose to forgive. After everything they did to him, selling him into slavery, letting their jealousy overcome them, many people would justify the revenge, and it's easy to. But here, Joseph chooses forgiveness. His forgiveness shows compassion and trust in God's plan and faith. Instead of continuing this cycle of hurt and betrayal that is seen all throughout Genesis, Joseph chooses reconciliation. And before we close out, I just wanted to touch on a few more thoughts. To recap, Adam and Eve taught us about free will, temptation, and the consequences of choices, while Joseph teaches us about perseverance, forgiveness, and trusting God even when life is difficult. Although these stories take place thousands of years ago, their messages can still apply today, especially when we consider how we make choices. Every day we will make hundreds of choices, some a lot bigger than others, and all of these choices have the ability to either benefit or hurt others. Sometimes we can succeed and sometimes we fall. Sometimes people hurt us and sometimes we hurt others. Sometimes we make mistakes and take responsibility, and other times we lie and deny. However, it's really important that Genesis reminds us that these choices matter, every single one of them. It reminds us that mistakes don't have to be the end. With God's trust and with love and faith and compassion, it is important not to let mistakes or sin define us and to always seek forgiveness, to make good choices, because mistakes do not have to be the end. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you for listening.